when the war started, because the way the war started, in other words, Japan attacking Pearl Harbor without declaring war, they just suddenly attacked. So many Japanese nationals were stranded in the United States and also in Canada. Many Americans and British were stranded in Japan. So even though they were at war, there was a treaty, an agreement between America and Japan that we will let certain Japanese in the United States, we will let them go back to Japan. And Japan said, well, we'll let certain number of Americans who are stranded in Japan, they can go back to America. So what they did agree to was called the exchange ship. And this exchange ship in 1942 and 43, there were two exchange ships. And what happened is 1,000 Americans who were in Japan and 1,000 Japanese who were in the United States and Canada, mostly United States, were chosen, and there would be exchange. How this exchange took place, if I can give you an example, the 1,000 Japanese from the United States and from just a few from Canada, they were all sent by rail to New York, and at New York they boarded a big ship, and because this was an exchange ship, they tried to pick a boat that was from a neutral country. So Sweden, which was considered neutral, and the big vessel from Sweden was called the Gripsholm. That's the name of the boat. It was a very famous boat, the Gripsholm. So the Gripsholm sailed from New York with 1,000 Japanese in 1942. And from Japan, 1,000 Americans and some British left from Yokohama, and these boats were going to meet somewhere. So the boat that left New York, because the war has already started, North Atlantic is in the middle of a war, so the boat from New York went to the south part of the Atlantic Ocean via South Africa, Cape Town, and on the east coast of Africa there was a Portuguese territory called Lourenço Marques. That's where the boat from the United States arrived, and the boat from Japan arrived, and 1,000 each on each boat. That's where they exchanged. So the Japanese that came on the Gripsholm were transferred to the Japanese boat that came from Yokohama, and the Americans were moved on to the Gripsholm, and that came back. So that was called the exchange ship. And the exchange ship, because of the numbers, took place in 1942 and another one in 1943. And actually in 1943, when my father was in Schreiber, he received a call from the International Red Cross because a certain Japanese person informed the Red Cross, this is a very sad case where the family is totally separated and they don't know what the other part of the family is happening. Mr. Kadota is in Canada with his two older sons. Mrs. Kadota is in Japan, but they have no communication. So through the International Red Cross, my father, who was in Schreiber, was asked, if you have the chance to go to Japan on the exchange ship, do you wish to go? And he apparently thought about it, and of course, it's during the war. Nobody knows what's going to happen. But he, of course, felt that, well, his wife and the younger ones were in Japan, so that perhaps he should join them and see what. So he applied to go on the second exchange ship in 1943. So again, from Schreiber, he went to Winnipeg, and from Winnipeg he joined the train that came from the United States and joined in Chicago. From Chicago on the train to New York, and these trains they were full of just the Japanese, so they were no windows. It was all boarded up, so they wouldn't see the outside. When they arrived in New York, the train would stop at the suburb outskirts of the city, and at night, when they couldn't see anything outside, they were put on a truck and taken to the boat in New York, and they sailed at night, so nobody saw anything. And that boat, the second year, was also the Gripsholm from New York, and it went down to South Atlantic, around South Africa. But instead of going to Lorenzo Marcus, the second exchange ship, on the east coast of India is a place called Goa. That's also Portuguese territory. So the boat from Japan came to Goa with 1,000 Americans, and the boat from New York, the Gripsholm, with 1,000 Japanese, and my father was one of maybe 15 Japanese were in Canada, and the rest were all from the States. So the two boats arrived in Goa. That's where they were exchanged, and that boat with 1,000 Japanese came back, arrived in Yokohama in November of 1943. So, and that trip from Schreiber, Ontario, to Winnipeg, to Chicago, to New York, and then on the boat and to Goa and back to Yokohama took my father. It was a total of 61 or 62 days, and he arrived in Yokohama. And I think my mother went to Yokohama. This is in 1943 during the war, and we were living in Kobe. So he came back to Japan. That's when my mother, after 3 years being separated, met my father. And so my older brothers continued to live in Canada. Well, they eventually went to Toronto and then Montreal. So that's quite different from the normal families or what happened, yeah.